April incursion of 2233 caused a split and a new timeline to appear. So what exactly are the major changes to Kirk's life from the normal Star Trek timeline and the Kelvin timeline created by the new Star Trek movies? Heads up, these are just going to be the major changes to Kirk's life between the two realities. I mean, who gives a shit if Kirk's favorite color is different between the primary reality and the Kelvin reality? Actually, that would be pretty interesting to know. And exactly what made him change his favorite color between the two. Oh, and because this triggered a shit ton of people on my other Star Trek video and I thought it was hilarious, by the time of the Star Trek TV shows, Earth has eliminated war, poverty, and disease. So basically, a pretty boring place. First, just in case people don't know, I'm going to be talking about two timelines. One, the main timeline or primary reality, which is where the TV shows and movies fit prior to the 2009 Star Trek movie reboot. And second, the Kelvin timeline, which is the new timeline or movie timeline caused by the incursion point and features the 2009 Star Trek movie and beyond. So we know in the primary timeline in 2387, there's ongoing tensions between the Romulans and the Federation. Despite these differences, this is the year the Romulans and Federation worked together to try to save the Romulan homeworld Romulus, which was in danger of being destroyed by a supernova. Although Spock was in charge of piloting a ship containing red matter to use to create a black hole and absorb the energy of the supernova, he arrived too late and Romulus was lost. Nero, controlling the mining vessel Narada, was nearby and blamed Spock for his world being lost. However, a black hole created by the red matter caused both ships to be pulled back in time and put at different points in the past. The Narada and her crew arriving in 2233 led to an incursion that altered the course of history and created the Kelvin timeline. So in 2233 we have the incursion point. In the primary reality, James T. Kirk is born and his dad survives, but in the Kelvin timeline, James T. Kirk is born this year and his dad dies shortly after.
Jim. Okay. Jim it is.
Sweetheart, can you hear me? I love you so much. I love you.
This, of course, is when we start to see major changes to Kirk's life, because, you know, you have to be born first before changes can happen to your life. Obviously, a big change is primary timeline Kirk grows up with his bio dad, where we see in the Kelvin timeline, Kirk grows up without his dad and has a stepdad he's not too enthused with.
Hey, are you out of your mind? That car's an antique. You think you can get away with this just because your mother's off planet? You get your ass back home now. You live in my house, buddy. You live in my house, and that's my car. You get one scratch on that car, and I'm gonna whip your ass.
And rebels against authority, where Kirk has his father in the primary reality. So with that background information out of the way, let's talk about the major differences between primary timeline Kirk and Kelvin timeline Kirk. First, Kirk in the primary reality began a 5-year officer training program at Starfleet in the year 2252. In the Kelvin timeline, Kirk wouldn't attend Starfleet Academy until 2255, 3 years after his primary counterparts joining. And of course, we know Kelvin timeline Kirk joined for very different reasons than primary timeline James T. Kirk.
Where you came from, did I know my father?
Yes. You often spoke of him as being your inspiration for joining Starfleet. He proudly lived to see you become captain of the Enterprise.
Captain.
1 year older. Yeah, that's usually how it works.
A year older than he ever got to be. He joined Starfleet because he believed in it. I joined on a dare.
As the destruction of the Kelvin and the knowledge that such a technologically advanced ship like the Narada existed, Starfleet was also changed in the Kelvin timeline, which I'll talk more about in a different video. Basically, in the Kelvin timeline, Starfleet adjusted its training and required their students to study the destruction of the USS Kelvin, and emphasis was placed on George Kirk's noble sacrifice. This unprovoked attack on the Kelvin also made the galaxy seem more dangerous, and the Federation wanted Starfleet to review their policy on peaceful exploration. Of course, we saw other changes in the Kelvin timeline from this attack, but again, this video is about Kirk only. Interestingly, while both timeline Kirks beat the Kobayashi-Maru scenario simulation by reprogramming it,
the Kobayashi-Maru scenario frequently wreaks havoc with students and equipment. As I recall, you took the test 3 times yourself. Your final solution was, shall we say, unique.
It had the virtue of never having been tried.
This is Commander Spock. He is one of our most distinguished graduates. He's programmed the Kobayashi-Maru exam for the last 4 years. Commander?
Cadet Kirk, you somehow managed to install and activate a subroutine in the programming code, thereby changing the conditions of the test.
Your point being?
In academic vernacular, you cheated.
in the primary timeline, Kirk gets a commendation and awarded for original thinking, where we see in the Kelvin timeline, Kirk is punished and actually suspended, which of course leads to Kelvin timeline Kirk sneaking aboard the Enterprise, which didn't happen in the primary timeline.
Jim, the board will rule in your favor. Most likely.
You call this a favor?
Yeah, you owe me one. Explain to Captain Pike why the Enterprise warped into a crisis without one of its senior medical officers.
As you were.
It's fascinating to me that the same act had different consequences in each timeline. Next, in the primary reality, Kirk served aboard the USS Farragut as a lieutenant in 2254, 1 year before Kelvin timeline Kirk even joined Starfleet. Alternate reality Kirk also served on this ship, but it's a bit muddled. A writer for Star Trek believes Kelvin timeline Kirk did serve aboard this ship for a semester, while the film's iTunes app says that Kirk spent 2 academic quarters aboard this ship and was awarded the Palm Leaf of Axanar Peace Mission of Valor in 2256, like his primary reality counterpart did. Next, 2258 is an important year in the Kelvin timeline because this is where primary timeline Spock is spit out and we see Vulcan is destroyed. Obviously, in the primary timeline, Vulcan is still intact, and into the 23rd century, the Vulcans are still thriving, where in the Kelvin timeline, only about 10,000 Vulcans are remaining, and their species is basically endangered.
In the face of extinction, it is only logical I resign my Starfleet commission and help rebuild our race.
And yet you can be in 2 places at once. I urge you to remain in Starfleet. I have already located a suitable planet on which to establish a Vulcan colony.
This is also the year the USS Enterprise NCC 1701 is launched under Captain Pike, and the USS Botany Bay is discovered and Khan is revived. Which is a huge change from the primary timeline, where the SS Botany Bay is discovered by Kirk and his crew in 2267. I mean, also, it was Spock that died in the original timeline, where in the Kelvin timeline it was Kirk that died and then was revived. Not to mention the dying from Khan's assholery was something that occurred much later in the primary timeline. I mean, primary Spock didn't even die from the Khan adventures until 2285, so big changes. Not to mention a discovery that sort of made death not a big deal in this new timeline, but we're gonna ignore that plot point. Oh, and I guess while we're here, primary reality Kirk never led an uprising against a first officer acting Captain Spock in the main timeline after Pike was taken by Nero. And Kirk was never marooned by Spock where he met a Spock from a different timeline in the main timeline. And Kirk never faced off against Nero in the main timeline. Anyways. So after Nero was defeated, that timeline actually got pretty close to the primary timeline. Ish. Kirk never lost command of the Enterprise after violating the Prime Directive, forcing him to be a first officer under Pike, but this Kirk is a bit more wild than our primary reality Kirk. But I think that's mostly because everything has to be flashy and intense with pew 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 nowadays, so they made Star Trek a little more action-packed. So shortly after that, next, in 2259 Kelvin timeline, Admiral Pike is killed in a terrorist attack at Starfleet headquarters, which Kirk is present for. This is in contrast to the primary timeline where Pike is incapacitated by severe radiation exposure in 2266, and Kirk isn't present for that. In fact, in the primary timeline, Kirk never witnesses Pike die, but is responsible in allowing him to live out the rest of his days with the Talosians, and their ability to give him the illusion of being whole again. Well, Spock kind of forced him to do it, but he was coming from a good place. Onwards, Kirk is made captain of the USS Enterprise about half a decade apart in the timelines. In the primary reality, Enterprise begins a 5-year mission of exploration with Kirk as its captain in 2265. In the Kelvin reality, Kirk gets it 5 years earlier in 2260. Despite this alternate timeline, Kirk would serve with the same primary crew he had in the main timeline, showing some things were just meant to be. Actually, there's been some really good arguments about fixed points in time in the Star Trek universe, regardless of what timeline you're in, and I love them so much. Of course, then there's the whole Beyond storyline, where in 2263, Kelvin timeline Kirk applies for a promotion as a vice admiral, does the whole swarm thing, takes command of the USS Franklin to destroy the swarm, then declines the promotion as Vice Admiral and continues on his 5-year mission on the USS Enterprise A. There's also the Boldly Go comics, which features the original series characters, but there's been mixed feelings on whether that's canon or not. Officials for CBS say only movie and TV are canon, so to be safe, I'm going with not talking about them, though they are fun to read if you want to buy them. Okay, so those are the mainest changes from primary timeline Kirk. Obviously, there were some major changes to Starfleet in general in the Kelvin timeline, but again, different video. So which is your favorite Kirk? Primary timeline Kirk or Kelvin timeline Kirk? Let me know in the comment section down below. Make sure you like, subscribe, and come back for more videos.